Good afternoon, everybody. This is the second afternoon session on the economic and financial consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. We have three speakers this afternoon. I'll introduce them one by one a little later. I think we can see that COVID-19 is first and foremost a human tragedy, but it's also presented really an unprecedented economic and financial shock to the world economy. Certainly, I mean, for example, in 2020, the IMF estimated that the global output contracted by 3.5%, and we've seen more of that. Not all countries, but most countries have felt this shock to some degree or other, rich and poor, large and small. And governments have tended to respond to the crisis with a series of fiscal measures designed to support the economy, jobs, subsidies, benefits payments, and so on. And this has led to concerns about debt financing. Luckily not in Hong Kong. We haven't done debt financing here, we didn't need to, but most countries are not in such a fortunate position. And this brings fears, I think, amongst economists about the future debt burden and also about the risk of inflation. It seems a long way away, inflation, but it is something that people are beginning to talk about. Now, there's arguably a light glimmering at the end of the tunnel. We hope it's at the end of the tunnel. Vaccination programs perhaps promise a way out of the pandemic, but, and there are buts, the implementation of vaccination programs will take time. And there is a risk that poorer countries could lose out in the meantime. And there are potential long-term impacts of the pandemic. Health-wise, we hear about the long COVID illness that's estimated to impact on as many as 1 in 10 of people who contract the disease. So the long-term health implications are not yet clear. And of course, there will be long-term economic effects. Industries and labour markets will not recover overnight. And there is this question of debt, to which we will return in this session. And we are also being warned that whilst we might be able to manage COVID-19, there is a strong likelihood that it will become endemic. So it's not a problem that's going away tomorrow. So I think in light of my brief introduction there, our topic, the economic and financial consequences of COVID-19, is obviously both timely and significant. I'm pleased to say we have 3 papers this afternoon dealing with different aspects of this. 2 papers focusing primarily on the financial impact and the debt implications of COVID, as I've mentioned. And then we have 1 paper dealing with the leadership issues and the management of the pandemic. I'll introduce the speakers as we come to the papers individually to save a little time. But let me just say a few words about the structure of the session. Reminding people. We have 3 papers, so what we must try to do is to make sure that we're limiting our presentations to about 20 or 25 minutes max, something like that. After each presentation, what I will do, I will ask if there are any urgent or burning or very specific questions about the particular paper we've just heard. 1 or 2 of those perhaps. And then what we'll do generally is we'll try and have a good piece of time at the end for a general discussion about the issues that we've raised. Okay, so first of all, let me just briefly introduce him. I know him very well, but others don't. Professor Huang is the Associate Dean of the School of Business. He's my colleague, and he's also the head of the Department of Management. Xu is a leadership researcher, an organization behavior researcher. I'm sure what he will be saying to many people in the social sciences will have some familiarity, but Xu's been very successful since he's come here. He's published in journals such as Admin Science Quarterly, Academy of Management Journal, etc., etc. And I've discussed this paper with him, so I'm interested to see it presented. Xu, over to you.
Thank you. So, can you hear me? All right. Thank you for this opportunity for me to present 2 projects. So I basically started this project with my colleagues a year ago. In April, because at that time our colleagues and especially our BPR, our vice president, called for research on COVID-19. And so I just formed a team and did the 2 projects. So this is about leadership. So I'm a psychologist, and I'm interested in understanding how leaders perform in different situations, especially in COVID-19. We want to understand how leader influence the organizational practices during crisis. So this is our initial idea, and this is my team. So we have many of my colleagues from HKBU and also from other university. And then we have people from business school, also from geography department. So this is a truly cross-disciplinary research. So this is the idea of leadership. For those who are not familiar with leadership research, this is what we know in management. True test of leadership is how well you function in a crisis. All right. So in a crisis, that's the really a good test of a leadership capability. All right. Bad leaders cause more deaths in a crisis of this kind. That's what we know. In such a large-scale crisis, the leaders should play an important role. And we know from news, from our experience in the last year, we see a lot of good leaders around the world. We also see some not very good leaders, right? So that really struck me a lot. So that's why we started this process. So I'm going to present 2 projects. I mainly focus on our findings, our results, because I know many of the audience coming from different disciplines, so I don't focus on theory. So I focus on what we found, right, based on evidence that we had. The first project is a study of Chinese cities' mayors. So we studied their influence on the spread of the disease in the first 54 days in China. So we have this daily infection cases for many cities, hundreds of cities. We select 177 cities to track how leadership, how their leaders influence the spread of disease. Then we move on. Since last June, we move on to the global context. So we wanted to understand how national leaders help contain the spread of disease. From the news, we see many leaders, coming out to speak up, talk about this crisis at the beginning of the pandemic, and some of them are quite enthusiastic, optimistic. Some of them more pessimistic. So we want to see whether the messages they sent to the public in the first week of the disease would have a significant impact on the spread of disease in the next in the next few weeks. So this is project 1. So we look at the spread of COVID-19 from January 19 to March 21 in China. And this is the figure showing the number of cities that reported the first infection cases. You can see that in January, all of a sudden there's huge there's a large increase in number of cities in China reported cases, right? Then the green line shows that how many cities successfully stopped the spread of the disease. Okay, so many of them start to stop the spread of disease in late February. Okay, in China. So this is the map we built. On the left is the number of people traveled from Wuhan to every city in China. So the darker the color means more people traveled from Wuhan city to that particular area of China. So according infectious disease model, more people coming out of Wuhan arrive in your city it is more likely your city will have more cases. Okay, this is what. This is the open data. We actually, this data is we collect this data from Harvard, right? From Harvard University, they have this database tracking all these cases, tracking all this population flow in China, right? On the right is the number of days every single city took to contain the spread of the disease. The darker color means that they took longer days. Okay, if you visually examine the two maps, you can see that there's not much correlation between number of people coming from Wuhan and the number of days they took, right? So in other words, there must be some other factors, which cannot be totally explained by medical model, right? Infectious disease model, right? Infectious disease model is very simple. More people coming from Wuhan, more cases. So, and more difficult to contain cases. But in this case, we observe certain variation. So this is the variation in certain cities. Some of the cities can contain the cases earlier, right? When they go flat, that means they contain successfully. Some cities took longer time. This is the map of all the cities. So there's a huge variation in China city. Even we know China is an authoritarian state, and the city mayor should follow the central instruction, but we can still see the variation. So that's why we want to see whether leadership effect would take place, right? So this is what we are looking at. We follow the management literature, right? So there's a recent paper looking at China. They look at the retirement age of China's governors, right? Provincial governors. So their idea is that if the governors are close to retire, they tend to be more modest in their decision making, right? They don't want to take risks. So this is because there are a lot of stake after retirement. If they make wrong decision, their retirement will not be smooth. So we follow that idea. We actually track every city mayor's age to see whether they're going to retire or not. So the red color means that those cities mayors are going to retire in the next 2 or 3 years. Okay, so this is their last term in their last political period of their political career. So, and this is our finding. All right, so I'll show you finding. The finding, first we have 4 indicators of spread of disease. The first one is the 14-day virus spread. The larger on the left, you see the larger number means the more cases. The higher rate of the spread of disease. So this shows that the dotted line shows that in these cities with the retiring mayors, the spread rate is deeper, is higher. For cities with the non-retiring younger mayors, they are doing a better job. Okay. So on the right, if you know any statistics, those are the scatter plot. Basically, they are reflecting the regression model. And the 21-day spread rate is the same. Okay. And we also have a curve flattening period. So we call it, because last year they talk a lot about the curve flattening period. So the same. You can see that so here is the population flow. The more people from Wuhan arriving in the city, the more likely there's fast growth of the rate, but only happened in cities with retiring mayors. Okay, so they are not doing a good job. So this is the same, but this is difficult to understand for you. Let me just. So we use the medical science model to predict that based on the first 14 days, we predict how many cases the city should have if there's no intervention. So if there's no intervention, there should, for example, in Hong Kong, if there's no intervention, there should be 100,000. And then we calculate the actual number of cases. So we make the difference. The difference is that if you make, the larger difference means that the CT did a good job. Originally, they should have 100,000. Now they only have 100 case. So this is, again, this graph is difficult to understand. Basically, we show the same pattern. In cities with retiring mayor, they're doing much better job. They've done a good job, much better job. Okay. So these are the other. Let me show you the more detail of the study. Basically, this is we could only track 177 prefecture level cities because, as a matter of fact, we found that many cities in China did not have any case at all. All right. So and then they contain, because they're so remote or for other reasons. So we only we only had this 177 cases. And these are the how we calculate population inflow. We based on Baidu mobility data. This is available data. Everyone can use it, and even some of our colleagues in this university use this data to track the spread of disease. And so this is how we calculate the 4 dependent variables. I don't know. And then retiring and non-retiring is treated mathematically as moderator. So we found these findings. We found these results. Okay. So the implication is here. So our group were very excited about this project because we somehow showed that leaders' characteristics can explain the spread of disease above and beyond the medical model, infectious disease model, right? And we have read a lot of papers in the first 2 or 3 months published in top journals like Science, Nature, and those medical journals. Most of these papers focus on the physiological and medical factors and environmental factors, but I think to us this is leadership is so important in such a crisis. Even tiny little difference in retiring and non-retiring leader, you can see the difference. Our theory, our explanation is this: in political science, we know that one primary incentive for politicians is their career, political career. Okay, so they are motivated to achieve the state objectives, right? Because they can have future career development. When these political agents reach the retirement, they start to they lose the major incentive of taking risks to achieve state objectives. That's why we see these kind of differences. Okay, so that's the first project. So I think this is what we normally I normally show to my colleagues and students, that as a leader in a crisis, it's very difficult for them to be neutral to the influence of their own self-interest. So I think as long as they understand their primary duty, they may be able to do a better job. So because of the first project, we move to the next one. The next one is that we want to see the national leaders. Okay. So here's the spread of disease in all countries, and we've seen a lot in the last year. And so we try to answer the question: what should national leaders signal to the public at the start of a crisis? We came up with these ideas because at the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen a lot of leaders coming out to the stage and talking about this disease. And from business research, we know that leaders like CEOs, they play a so important role in signaling to the public, to the stakeholders, what they want to do, what can be done, what cannot be done, right? So I think as a national leader, they play an even more important role in shaping people's attitudes towards this crisis, right? Not only the citizens but also their officials. That's why I came up with this idea. So based on political science literature, during crisis, national leaders should do these 6 things, right? Like leaders should put public safety first. Leaders should prepare for the worst. Leaders should be sensitive to warnings about future crisis. And leaders should be, should take charge, and they should be compassionate, and etc. You see, if you look at these 6 actions they should take, many of the national leaders did a good job. Like you can see New Zealand, leaders from New Zealand, leaders from Taiwan, and but you can see some leaders may just do the opposite, right? So I think this is what really motivated us to do this research, to see what they react. Based on our business research, we know that leaders, as I said, their emotion, the messages they send, their tone can make a huge difference, right, to the public. And that's why we designed this project. What we did is that we want to understand the national leaders' positive or negative sentiment in the first week of pandemic. Right? After they report the first case in this country, what did they say to the public? So we track their Twitter, right? So we use AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, to assess whether the messages they tweet are positive or negative, in terms of positive and negative, and we want to see whether the positive and negative sentiment would influence the spread of disease in the country in the next 4 weeks, right? This is what we did. And there's also a lot of debate about whether democratic or non-democratic societies did a good job or bad job in containing the disease. And we use a better measure. This is we call it inertia. They call it inertia of daily cases. Basically, we track the spread of disease, using another method, and this is our finding. The finding is opposite to many of the expectations of my colleagues, but we predict it based on theory. Based on psychological theory, we know that in a crisis of this scale, you have to warn the public. Alert public. You should not be too positive. You should be more vigilant, right? So our finding shows that if the leaders send more negative sentiments in their Twitter, the spread of disease is lower. The rate of spread is lower. If they are too positive, then there are more people infected in the next 3 to 4 weeks. All right. So, and this is also we found there is slight main effects of democracy. So democracy is not bad. Democracy is good. So democratic societies tend to have a slightly better performance than the non-democratic societies. But that figure is not stable. So we cannot make a strong conclusion about whether the society, we use the UN index to capture the democracy. So this is our finding, which show basically you can see that leaders' negative sentiment would have a lower spread of disease, right? If they are too positive, the spread of disease is more serious, and this effect is stronger in democratic societies. That's understandable. In all democracies, the leaders always come out. They're more transparent. They talk more, right? People pay more attention to leaders. So the implication is that in democratic societies, in a crisis of this kind, whatever they say would have huge influence on the interest of the public. Okay. So I think that's all I want to say. 25 minutes.
Thank you, Sue. Let's just see if we have one or two questions, specific questions about the studies that Sue has done. We do?
Yeah.
Indeed.
Thanks. That's a really interesting paper. Fascinating. I just wanted to, not query, but just ask, I suppose, compare the two studies in a way. Because clearly the first one, you're taking 137...
77.
Oh, 177 mayors, yeah. And in a way, that I suppose that unit of analysis you can easily compare, can't you? Because they're sort of the same, really, aren't they? So so you can take that as a sort of individual level, I suppose, of analysis quite nicely. But then when you get to the national leaders, clearly, I mean, you're looking at the tweets, which is fine, and it brings in the discursive element. But I suppose those national leaders are each operating in extremely different, I suppose, institutional configurations, even amongst the democracies. I mean, it struck me that a national leader of a federal system, for example, I think about Germany, you know, is clearly constrained by, both in discursive terms, but also in institutional terms, by the nature of German federalism, whereas a French president, you know, would have a different way of speaking that would integrate less, perhaps, the territorial dimension. So I just wonder, I mean, you probably can't, there's not much you can do about this, but I wonder if you compare your two studies, you know, what does that say really about, I suppose, is it easier really to capture the 177 city mayors than it is to get the broader take of the national leaders?
I think you're right. We in the China data, it's the cities are comparable. They are the same level of city, and the structure is almost the same. So we automatically control for many differences across the regions. In the country data, in the global data, we try to control for many things like culture, GDP, and medical resources, and we control for even the population density. So that some other colleagues raised a similar question. This federal system versus non-federal system may have an impact on leadership effects. So we haven't done that. We will do that, you know, in the next step. But the one thing I like, the second paper, the second project, is that we found a strong main effects of leader sentiment, even though the sample is small, 144 nations. We have such a strong main effect, meaning that the chance we can, you know, still have the main effect after controlling all those things may be strong, maybe still high, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, of course.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. First of all, just a brief remark. May come back to that issue later, but I don't think the nature of the political system is really a decisive factor of success or failure. I mean, I've come across a number of studies.
Yeah.
It's not really a meaningful factor. I want to push you a bit more on one of your assessments or hypotheses of success. You indicated the number of deaths.
Oh no, number of cases, infection cases.
Infection, okay. Because I mean, every leader, whatever the political system is, has to struggle with two conflicting objectives: saving lives and making sure the economy is not going to stop. And I think the same type of dilemma had to be addressed by every leader at local level, national level. So have you looked at how much the economy has been affected by COVID, and depending on the way the local leaders, national leaders have managed the crisis?
We don't have this kind of data. I know some colleagues in business schools in different places are working on that, how the decisions influence the economic development of a nation. But our idea is this: in leadership research, we know that leaders, especially those major leaders in companies and nations, what they are saying reflects what they are thinking in most of the time. Okay, so and what they are thinking would definitely influence how they implement their measures containing the disease or making economic whatever decisions. So from that we developed this project, and we want to see how the leaders message, the messages sent by the leaders influence the whole thing. The message not only influence the population, but also the government officials, whether they take this crisis seriously or not. All right. So I think we're looking at that. Then, of course, the decision, there are many reasons behind it. They want to balance economic development or the life and death. So we didn't look at that. We look at the final decision, what they do, right? So then we can see from their messages sent through Twitter.
Let me just introduce you briefly to the colleagues, because not everyone will know you. Paola Subacchi, I hope I've pronounced your family name correctly, is Professor of International Economics at the Global Policy Institute, Queen Mary University of London. She's also a visiting professor at the University of Bologna, and she holds a number of non-executive directorships with various companies and organizations. She writes regularly on Project Syndicate, and her work focuses on the functioning and governance of the international and financial monetary system. Her latest book, The Cost of Free Money, How Unfettered Capital Threatens Our Economic Future, was published in July 2020 by Yale University Press. So there's a plug there, Paola. I'm doing you but thank you. Her paper is on COVID-19, a global debt crisis, as a question mark. So Paola, over to you.
Thank you very much, and greetings from London, which is definitely grayer and colder than Hong Kong. This adds to my frustration of not being with you in person. But anyway, thank you very much for the invitation to this conference, and I listened to with great interest to the previous speakers. A quick presentation within the time limit. But I'm delighted to present the results of a research, an ongoing research project, and I'm coordinating at Queen Mary University of London with my colleague Rodrigo Olivares-Caminal, who is a professor of banking and financial law. We look into the debt crisis, and in particular, we look at the contract and the issues around debt resolutions and debt restructuring. So how basically where we are and where we are likely to go, and how we resolve this issue. So I'm just a quick overview of my talk. I will actually look at the current state of play, so where we are in terms of debt accumulation, and I will also present the initiative that internationally that have been put together in order to mitigate the impact on debt, in particular on poor countries, on low-income countries. I will then discuss the issue about crisis prevention versus crisis resolution, and saying my argument is that we tend to intervene always when there is a crisis, and in terms of crisis resolution, we are quite effective. The big issue which we haven't been able to solve, and I'm talking we in terms of in the international community, the international organization, we haven't been able to have an effective crisis prevention system. And I will conclude with a few notes of the forward policy agenda. I will start with an overview of the debt. We'll just say, again, the international debt is at record highs. The concern at the moment are around the debt, the sustainability of debt incurred in emerging market and developing countries. Having said that, there are obviously the level of debt in advanced economy is very significant, but to some extent the sustainability looks at the moment more manageable. And But again, it would be wrong to think that this accumulation of debt came as a result of the COVID crisis. That's not the case. The COVID crisis basically has exacerbated an already difficult position. And again, in 2018, for example, the Global Financial Stability Board, which is part of the G20, warned about the level of debt. So, and again, there are reasons why we have this debt in currency is the result and the tail effect of the global financial crisis, the collapse in oil prices and commodity prices, which was particularly difficult for developing countries, and low interest rates. As for September 2020, about 42% of low-income countries were at risk of external debt distress, and this is a significant number. But they were already at the level in February 2020. So we have about 36 of the low-income countries were at high risk of debt distress in February 2020, therefore before the outbreak of the crisis. As for April 2021, we have we have 7 countries in debt distress, so they already are in some kind of debt restructuring and default and so on. And 29 at high risk, 23 moderate risk, and 10 at low risk. And these are, again, talking about low-income countries. So this is a sort of representation of where we are. And you can see then the levels were already high before 2020, but there will be a significant increase as a result of the crisis. Why? It's clear it's because of the higher spending the country needed to incur in order to mitigate the health and economic effects of the crisis. There were falling revenues due to tax revenue to the lower growth and trade, high financing costs for vulnerable countries that have limited access to external financing. And again, I stress this because it's an important point that will come later. So again, this really is a critical situation. For some countries, it's even more critical, and I have this chart here where I show that then is being issued in foreign currency, mainly in US dollars, which actually aggravate the level of certainly the risk exposure for developing countries. Obviously, this chart refers specifically on Latin America, where there be also an increase in external borrowing, but also, as you can see, a substantial increase, and this is very worrying, about debt which is not investment grade. So again, that poses a lot of problems in terms of resolution. This also says that this kind of exposure to the dollar makes also complicates to some extent the monetary policy of the Federal Reserves, because obviously there will be an increase and a change in a shift in monetary policy could seriously undermine the financial stability of some of these countries. So again, we have a sort of many sort of linked effect. In the meantime, what we can see from this chart is also then lessons haven't been learned. So some of these countries in Latin America, and I refer specifically to Argentina, were there before, and to some extent, again, lesson on how to manage debt, how to incur debt, how to be transparent and accountable. I mean, government in incurring debt hasn't been learned. And so we are, again, in a critical situation. And I concluded this also overview with saying that there are countries, again, Argentina and Ecuador, Latin America, have already concluded that restructuring. And actually, there might be a second round. And Zambia and Lebanon are work in progress. There is another element which is very important we need to take into account. The situation is complicated and complex right now because of the role of China. China is now the largest bilateral lenders in the world. And you can see from this chart the increase in the China outstanding overseas debt claim. So again, China has shifted significantly from being a recipient of inflows to become a more active investors. Again, the numbers obviously are not the number are important, but are not huge in the sense that FDI, China outflow in FDIs are important. You can see in this chart, but they are still, in the same. They could be much larger. Let's put it this way. This actually is in this chart. We see the overseas debt claims by China as a percentage of the global GDP. So this is an important development that we need to take into account for any kind of debt restructuring. Here's more or less the same theme. You see the debt exposure of countries, again, poor countries, many of them in Africa, exposure to China through various type of lending. So we got Belt and Road projects, we get direct lending, we get sovereign, and so on. So it's again interesting and complex, and you can see some of these countries are significantly exposed to China. Example, Djibouti went from being around below 10% of GDP to about 35% of GDP in terms of debt exposure to China. And obviously China, as you know, is also very important and the most important lender, bilateral lender in Asia. And this is another visual effect of this. Okay, what do we do for this? Obviously the crisis sort of just made clear the COVID, then this debt crisis for low-income countries. There were very, I would say, shift and broad responses from the multilateral financial institutions, specifically the IMF. So again, a significant amount of debt reliefs and flexible credit lines were made available. At the same time, the G20 in April 2020 came up with this debt service suspension initiative, which basically means low-income countries can actually suspend the payments, so debt servicing, until originally was December 2020, now is December 2021. So it's a sort of suspension, but obviously is not a resolution, because eventually this country will have to go back to them today, to debt repayments. And the other initiative is this common framework for debt treatment, which was being basically devised to try to bring into the discussion and the coordinated action China as the bilateral lender. Saying again, the SSI is partial and temporary, good relief, but not much. And again, is specific for 73 countries, low-income countries. 47 so far have requested participations. Others are still they haven't requested. Again, interesting, it's an attempt to get the private sector involved and together with the multilateral lenders. Common framework, again, Zambia and Angola are the two examples of countries that requested this common framework. Zambia defaulted on its repayment on China, and partly, again, Zambia was very exposed. Again, back to the point I made at the beginning. The COVID exacerbating an already unsustainable situation. But both countries are exposed with China. And this gets very complicated. And again, I don't think that there is time here to discuss, but just bear in mind the role then a bilateral lender like China that is not a member of the Paris Club makes in this the situation extremely complicated. And again, to give you a bit of color about the renegotiation of Chinese debt and why this makes complicated the debt restructuring at the multilateral level. Is this give you a sense of the renegotiation of that China's been involved since 2001 to November 2020, and you can see then. First of all, there is the need of countries, borrowers from China to actually go into debt restructuring because it has become unsustainable. And you can see that again, the acceleration of the strength through the crisis. And the other interesting thing is China doesn't go normally through debt cancellation, but more is the preferred say modus operandi is to defer or reschedule or continue negotiation. So again, this is very complicated. This is to say, and I will conclude, if this is a situation, what do we do? One big point is we don't have a multilateral framework for debt restructuring. So we never had it. It's been on the international agenda for a long time. It's still there. It has become more complicated, and so it's not very clear how we're going to move forward. Although there'll be a number of suggestions. What we say in our project and in this ongoing project is we need to tackle debt management at before it becomes an explosive, difficult situation. So we need a crisis prevention policy framework, which is more important than having a multilateral resolution mode, which is also important, but I think it would be better always not to arrive to a crisis before intervening. This is because the post-crisis resolution is always very expensive, very difficult, got huge cost, human cost as well, economic cost, financial. And then again, because of this complication, due to the new role of China as a creditor, and China, again, when I say China, it's not China as a whole. China is different entities, and each of these entities plays a different role in the type of loans that have been negotiated, so making the whole resolution system extremely complicated. So because of this, we need to have an ex-ante policy framework. And what we suggest, based on the contracts we analyze, is we need a policy framework centered around transparency, rule of law, and all the actors to account, which doesn't happen all the time or many times, particularly in low-income countries, in particular in countries with limited capacity to really manage debt. And again, we recommend a sound macroeconomic framework for debt management. So there is a lot of capacity building, a lot of action at the multilateral level, and a lot of, again, transparency and the rule of law at the country level, which is somehow, and again, to some extent, it resonates with what the previous speaker was talking about, the role of leaders in crisis. I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paola. Do we have one or two specific questions on the paper we've just heard? We do, from the floor.
Well, thank you for this presentation. Maybe I turn my head so I can see the speaker can see me. I'm Jean-Pierre Cabestin from HKBU. Yes, you've mentioned quite a lot China as a big lender. I would like to have your view on the so-called debt trap diplomacy. It looks like the Belt and Road Initiative has put a number of developing countries or less developed countries into a real trap, a debt trap. So can you tell us more about your view on the issue? Thank you.
Well, the view of the issue is very complicated, and I don't think there is such a thing as a view, but there are actually data that shows how much there's been a build-up of debt exposure to China. This is for a number of reasons. And again, actually, we'll be doing some work on specific on Asia. In fact, I presented another paper a couple of days ago at another conference in San Francisco, so it's really nice to travel. Just being from my office in in London, and that was exactly to look at the type of non-financial conditions that are attached to some of these debt. The problem is, being a bilateral lending, transparency is limited because these are contracts between two parties, and they are not the usual disclosure then you see when you have multilateral lending. And this is why it's so important that we go back and we look into multilateral lending. We strengthen the framework for multilateral lending, because exactly it's a way to avoid this kind of debt trap diplomacy. So why we ended up here? First of all, we say both the Europeans and the Americans completely ignore some areas in the world, in particular Africa. And so there were somehow, gaps there that were easily, where China could actually take advantage. No, I would say take advantage, become a bilateral lender. So again, the conditionality and the strict conditionality to some of the IMF programs or the World Bank programs were not particularly helpful. Let's say, benevolent negligence of Europe and Europe in particular vis-a-vis Africa didn't help. And it was like, it's easy money. And it's not easy money in the sense that China doesn't lend at concessional terms, because again, contracts, what we can see in contracts available, you can see very clearly that multilateral lending is concessional. Chinese lending is not concessional. It's just below market rates, but is certainly non-conditional. And that is a big advantage for countries that need funding. And need funding specifically for infrastructure building. And we got a lot of stories of, buildings, infrastructure then were totally useless. They were over the budget, late, and they were basically totally inefficient. And a lot of also what we say, elephant in the desert, whatever it is, white elephant, whatever we want to call it. So basically not particularly useful for the development of the country in question, but created a debt liability. So it's a very complex situation, and now there is the understanding China needs to be brought into this discussion, and in fact, China is involved in this discussion through the G20, but again, as I said before, when we say China, we talk about a big box where everything it's very difficult to untangle the various parties that are involved in these debt contracts.
Right, let me just introduce you, because not everyone will know you, so let me just do that briefly. Alicia Garcia.
Oh, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah,
sorry. Yeah, I hope.
Yeah. Alicia Garcia-Herrero, she's is Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis. She's also serving as Senior Fellow at the European think tank BRUEGEL, non-resident Research Fellow at the East Asia Institute at the National University of Singapore, and she's also a adjunct professor at our local neighbor here, Hong Kong UST. So welcome, Alicia.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks for the kind introduction, and I'm very happy to see friends and colleagues around. It would have been wonderful to be in Hong Kong, but increasing difficulties for cross-border traveling made it impossible for me. So on that note, I'm going to start right away with some thoughts. I have to say a lot of what Paola just mentioned will sound a little bit repetitive, so I may skip a little bit of what I have for you and focus on a proposal that we're making to the T20 under the Italian G20 presidency on solutions to the struggles that the developing world will go through and is already going through in terms of debt dynamics. So the first thing is really how big the toll. Well, it's impossible to measure, but I would like to dispel the idea that we sometimes hear in the media that Asia is relatively unscattered from this crisis. I think that's actually not factually correct, and we should review that idea to also be more aware of the needs really for debt restructuring, even in the region. So the debt dynamics, how worrisome they are, and how, and this is a little bit what Paola was saying, and I very much agree, how small and how hardly coordinated, although there's been an attempt, which I acknowledge, but it's not been very successful in terms of coordination of creditors. And then this proposal that we're making, as I said, to the G20, and then some general conclusions. So the toll, how big the toll? Well, just as a sense of dimension, the average growth rate for Asia in 2020 was lower, of course, negative, but lower than that in 1997. So that's basically what we have experienced. Of course, the recovery has been rather fast in 2021, although we still are unsure as to how much of the forecasted recovery will actually happen, because we are in the midst of a new wave in many geographies. This might be less the case of China, but it's certainly the case of large economies, India being a case in point, and of course Thailand and many other parts of Asia. So the recovery might not be as strong, and that's important for debt dynamics. So how worrisome? First of all, if you look at the fiscal packages in the region, you can figure that some have been quite substantial. This graph comes from the IMF, but we have our own estimation of China's consolidated fiscal deficit, and it hovers around 18.8, so around 19% of GDP. So it's a very big deficit. So in that regard, I think we can imagine that debt to GDP in Asia is going to rise quite steeply. Certainly in Singapore, for some are really surprised to see Singapore in such a high ranking in terms of debt, stock of debt to GDP. But the corporate world in Singapore is quite indebted, not as much as China, by the way, but also quite indebted. So basically, those profiles look, for me, staggering. We always think it's just the US and Europe, but there is a lot of debt in Asia as well. And the dynamics won't be as worrisome for developing Asia in terms of stock, because it's still rather low, but in terms of flow, especially given that some of the lending continues. There's a lot of discussion as to whether China is lending at all these days. You have the Inter-American Dialogue, which is outside of the region, saying that not really, it's zero. I mean, just the fact that the number is zero makes it very, for me, not very credible. It's very hard to see zero lending, either negative or, like repayment, but zero is a hard number to achieve. And in that regard, I think there's a lot of hidden lending at the moment, but lending continues, because without lending, and this is basically evergreening of existing loans, rescheduling of existing loans. So there is lending, and that will imply overall, over time, an increase in debt and a worsening of debt dynamics in Asia. If you add to this that what happened in March and April actually wasn't really the G20 coming to earth and solving all of the problems. What happened in March, we changed the dynamics of a collapse in portfolio flows into the emerging world, including Asia, was very, very simple, is that the Fed, basically changed tone, not only domestically, but also cross-border, as Paola mentioned, by introducing a number of currency swaps, but also a rather generous refinancing, repo refinancing facility, which was accessible to every central bank in the world. So basically, not every central bank in the world, but most central banks in the world. So on that note, I think that is what made the difference, i.e. opening the robinet, as we say, like more liquidity, which then spread it out into the emerging world. The problem is that we know very well this might change. Yeah, we're all discussing when the Fed will taper, and that already now by March 2021 has brought net capital inflows into the emerging world to zero. So in other words, the bell is ringing for potentially disruptive debt dynamics because there's no new flow. And that's when the problems can start. So how was the solution so far? So I think I already hinted to the fact that it was very small, just kicking the can down the road, kicking it, by the way, several times, all the way to December 2021. But the very beginning of the G20 session was December 2020. So basically, it was a very short window of opportunity for nothing but delaying payments. So I wouldn't call this a solution whatsoever. There was a lot written for the mere fact that it looked surprising that new creditors, this is not only China, even India, were brought into the creditor pool. And that sounded like a G20 success, because that's the difference. Yeah, the old creditors versus the new creditors. But the reality is that many problems remain unsolved. And I think the very obvious one was the distinction between solvency and liquidity, not being even discussed. So as if every problem were a liquidity problem. And we know very well, because there's been some restructuring since Ecuador, and of course in Africa as well. I think we know very well that many of those problems weren't only liquidity problems. The other one is, of course, the coordination of creditors. So yes, there's been an attempt, but there's been bilateral restructuring going on, which shows that the coordination wasn't perfect. Yeah, by all means. I think the very difficult role of the IMF, because this G20 debt relief doesn't include multilaterals. It's only official creditors, meaning sovereign or sovereign guarantee official creditors. So it is in itself quite hard to think that multilaterals are not going to be involved. And I think that makes it very difficult for the IMF role. I think the IMF has tried to compensate by creating new facilities, by claiming that it doesn't have the resources, but the truth is that it hasn't really pulled into the other creditors' attempts to solve the problem. And I think I would add to what Paola said on whether China is, the nature of the lending in terms of the cost of funding. I would also add that it adds to the complication that the two policy banks are treated differently in terms of their participation in the DSSI, as you probably all know, with China Development Bank remaining outside of that endeavor. So that makes it even more complicated, because the amounts we are talking about are humongous. In fact, this is a paper we wrote for BRUEGEL, where it shows that China, in terms of the coverage of the DSSI official, if we look at official bilateral debt service in the months after the decision, is just basically the bulk of it. And there, again, this is official bilateral debt service. We're excluding, because we can't really say it is China Development Bank. So just imagine. So thinking that China is not entering the Paris Club kind of way of thinking, rightly so, or maybe rightly, or at least obviously so, because it's so much bigger in terms of the actual debt service today. So it is, to me, impossible to think that this is going to be solved with a new DSSI, a new attempt to. So what we are proposing for that reason, and this is just one of the very many proposals. So in other words, I'm not claiming that this would solve all of the problems whatsoever. If I could do that, probably I would have to knock at I don't know how many doors because I have the crystal ball, and no, I don't. And this is a joint work with Gong Chen from the BIS, and the only thing we're trying to do is just what I would say just a solution out of perhaps very many that could be used. And this is just a small part, because I know I don't have to go through all of the details, but to give you a sense of what we're proposing is really to create something not too different from what the Europeans created at the beginning of the European sovereign crisis. And this is a that was the European Financial Stability Facility, which this time around would be what we call a World Recovery Fund. And the idea behind is that whoever is interested, and I give you two types of stakeholders who could be interested, to give guarantees, which was the model of the EFSF, to then swap existing debt on the one hand from the developing world into less costly, so lower interest rate or longer maturity debt. Whoever would be interested to do that would need to come with guarantees. Who could be interested? Obviously, China. To me, it's quite obvious that China has, as we speak, I would say a credibility problem on this topic. Yeah, there's a lot of pressure on why is this not working, and you've become such a big creditor, so do something. Yeah, I've seen panels, with African leaders. I mean, it is tough now for China. So I think diluting that kind of responsibility into a pool of guarantors would be good for China. Then, of course, the question is, but then why would others shoulder China? Yeah, I mean, why would others come to the pool? Our idea here is that the fund needs to have in its governing principles to swap existing debt, or even, because it has two functions, swap existing debt or give new funding, yeah, for new projects. In both cases, the fund would have to evaluate the nature of the lending, of the new lending, or the swapping of the existing lending. So far, it is used to the best of the country's ability to, of course, climate change, global health issues, etc. So the idea is that if you manage to do that, you could bring higher rating countries than China, because you need that to get low funding from your liability side to then swap. So you could think of Norway, you could think of the Netherlands, Denmark, countries that could perhaps think that this is a joint effort to improve the final use of the lending into the emerging world. You can imagine reducing coal power plants, you can imagine, all kinds of things, of course, COVID related, etc. So that's the idea in a nutshell. And, if you look at simply what I'm saying in a little infographic, this is it. It's like you give a new loan to a developing country, you take the old loan, and how do you finance this? You issue debt, at very low cost, because you may be maybe AA, and you can do that. Of course, once you have the guarantees from countries that would have an interest, and that's in a nutshell the idea. When we've presented this, the first question I get is, where's the IMF? I said, well, the IMF cannot do this because the IMF is a box, it's not a fund, meaning it can't leverage. So by nature of things, the IMF cannot perform a role that goes beyond, giving what we used to call the catalyzer of private money. But it's not working. It's only working in as far as there's a lot of liquidity out there, so it goes to the emerging world. But it's not because of the role of the fund as catalyzer. So we think that there has to be an institution, a fund, that does that for the emerging world. I'm not going to get into the details of how this works. I mean, we can get this into the Q&A. There's many questions as to the criteria. I think Paola had a very point I fully agree, which is the idea of the conditionality of IMF programs. I mean, for what you get. I mean, the conditionality for what you get. Because of the quota system, some countries, just get very little compared to what they need, but the degree of conditionality is humongous. Now, that conditionality now is at the worst of all times, because one, of course, is debt sustainability. And with the prospects that we have ahead of us, it is going to be very hard for developing countries to prove their debt sustainability. Thus, there will be no money unless you move out of that straitjacket. Of course, one would have to decide what to do if a country has no IMF program, because, how do you give the money otherwise? Our call is collateral. You may say this sounds like a very Chinese kind of option, but I think it is the one and only way for guarantors to feel the possibility to lend without an IMF program if that country's debt sustainability exercise doesn't allow for such a program. So you could think of many types of collateral. I won't get into that. So in conclusion, I think whoever thinks that COVID is done because we have the vaccines would need to look more carefully at the scars. And we have all kinds of scars from immigration. We're starting to see that in Southern Europe, but we'll see it everywhere, and it's unstoppable. We need growth and opportunities in the countries that are going to suffer the most. And these are the developing countries. I think it's become obviously clear. And there are developing countries in Asia. Whoever doesn't want to see it should just look at the map and, income per capita and realize what's going to happen in the region. And for that, I don't think we have the tools. The DSSI is certainly not the tool, starting with the selection of countries to, the duration. Basically, by the time we finish this this conference, there's only 6 months left of that relief. Yeah, I mean, it's just not going to work. And this means we have very little time to find other solutions. So I'm not arguing that ours is the best on earth, but I'm just putting it forward because we need to think of ways that go beyond an IMF program. It's not going to solve debt restructuring. And the debt restructuring we are seeing so far, very much on a bilateral basis, will create programs down the road in terms of new money, new funding from others, which will feel that they can be squeezed in the future again. So I hope, that's my last word, time to act. And I leave it there.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you very much. Stimulating proposal for any questions, first of all, on Alicia's paper from the floor? Or I guess we could open it up more widely now anyway. We're at the end. Yeah.
Alicia, nice to see you. I thought you were
nice to see you.
Taiwan. Now it's less safe than before. Anyway, I have two questions to you, and also maybe to Paola to some extent. The first one is about the DSSI and the G20 and China's representatives' position and behavior in that format. Has it been changing over the month? Do you see any change of mind or change of strategy? Is China more engaged and more engaging in the DSSI? That's my first question. A more economic question, which has to do with the risks of inflation. There's so much money put in the system by Joe Biden, by other leaders. There will be inflation down the road. What will be the impact of inflation of this debt situation? Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for the great questions. It was hard for me to hear, but I think I got it. First, has China changed its attitude within the DSSI? And second, inflation. Will inflation wipe out the problem we are discussing? So on China's, I mean, I'm nobody to say because I don't sit at the G20 and I don't have enough first-hand information, but I can only share my personal, kind of feeling of the different fora where we've presented our proposal. And the first one is, this is from the Italian presidency, oh, don't touch that topic, it's too political. I'm like, okay, but it's still important. So, frankly speaking, I think there is a little bit of a fear, generalized fear that this is a big issue and that we should let it be because China will find its ways to negotiate, and that the more we put pressure, the worse it will be. I mean, that's my personal feeling. But I actually think that even for China, it might be good to jump on a proposal that dilutes China's responsibility. I mean, I think it's perfectly logical to think that that could be a way out with a new institution, not existing institution. Because that's where China can, for example, decide, which is very, very important for China, every discussion I have had, including with my co-author, who told me up front, I'm happy to talk about restructuring, but never talk about change in face value, meaning, not face value, sorry, net present value. So meaning China cannot accept, and it's just a kind of a value-driven proposition, that money is not repaid. And by the way, in Europe, we have countries, as Paola knows, that have that very same mindset on debt and so on. And nothing wrong with it. It's just very, I mean, it's just what it is. But then we need to find solutions where there is no loss, apparent loss. And I think a fund can allow for that, because you are taking the maturity, you are increasing the maturity profile, lowering the interest rate, but you're not supposedly accepting a haircut. And I think in the funds world, I can tell you, if your debt is not sustainable in there, you need to accept a haircut. So I'm saying, we're in a cul-de-sac with the existing channels, mechanisms. That's why I think it's good to innovate and create something different to avoid that, let's call it cultural crash or something like that. On the second point, frankly speaking, inflation is a solution for the US. Inflation is a solution for Japan. Inflation is a solution for Europe, in the sense that as a debtor, you obviously benefit. But any developing country will face what we call balance sheet effects. Very simply, their exchange rate will depreciate, and a lot of the debt is in hard currency, so it will only balloon. So inflation is not a solution for them, because it's linked to the exchange rate dynamics. I'm not saying anybody, but this is a general statement. For most countries, inflation is not a solution. Actually, it makes things even worse.
Paola, would you like to give some thoughts on the, particularly on the inflation question? It seems to me, I think that's of interest.
Inflation question is a non-question, and it's actually short-term, not long-term. Lots of people, I think there is a disconnect at the moment between what markets think about inflation. They want to see, markets are on borrowed time. They've been on borrowed time since 2009, and so they are very, very concerned. And I can see in the in the investors community, there is a huge concern about inflation. Is a problem, is a market sentiment, as opposed something that is actually supported by data. Of course, we have inflation, we have increasing inflation, and it depends again, very, very, very sectorial and very in the short term, but we're not going into, like 1970s, 1980s kind of inflation. And of course, there is a sort of incentive for the Fed to stay on hold for a while and even sort of ignore its own 2% target for the simple reason that there is a lot of concern about financial stability, which will spill over not only in the United States and in the advanced economy, but also on developing countries, exactly for the reasons that Alicia highlighted. But obviously, they have to be careful. So there will be a bit of inflation is an added bonus, but obviously they need to be kept under control. On China, I like to stress that there are two problems with China. China is in an equally difficult position. So as a bilateral lender, don't believe that because China got so much financial resources, it's very strong. And it's the two risks are, one, first of all, China lends in dollars. So that means then it takes the default risk as well as the exchange rate risk. And so, and it is not a nice position to be. And number two is China is under a lot of pressures. Actually, the multilateral institutions are a lot of pressure not to lend to countries that are bilateral debtors of China. So the question is, we say IMF are going to sort of do a program and set a program with, say, Zambia, and what happened to the money? Will that be used to pay back China? And the United States, i.e. the main shareholders of the IMF, is very much against this kind of solution. So again, and you can see this huge asymmetry, like case of Argentina, where the IMF poured an enormous amount of money in this basically now serial defaulters, and I'm using my colleagues, co-author and co-researcher, who is Argentinian and he's been involved in some of the debt restructuring there. And, and still we haven't learned lessons. But on the other hand, the IMF is very careful about putting money into, say, Pakistan, that is very much exposed to China. So there are these kind of dynamics that need to be taken into account, and they are very, very important. So China has an interest and is becoming more cooperative. And it's always been cooperative inside the G20. Obviously, they play this game. They say, well, but if we talk about the say credits that China policy banks, say the Chinese development banks, which are actually private entity in the sense they are obviously state-owned and state-sponsored, but they have their own sort of juridical separate entity. So again, the Chinese say that's not a problem. These are private entity, therefore they should be under a different kind of framework. So again, it's very, very complicated, and I know that the Italian G20 presidency is very much involved into this issue. Obviously, we're careful, with a lot of care, because Italy is a large debtor, so we got a large sovereign debt, so they have to be careful how they move. One thing then we didn't mention in this discussion is the decision that was taken at the last spring meetings, so IMF, World Bank, and G20, to go for a new issuers of SDRs. So, and these are non-conditional, and they will make available to 4 countries above their natural sort of quotas, so how much they are entitled based on their quota. This is a very important development that was made possible because the United States have a different administration. This is something that the Trump administration strongly opposed, while Yellen was very much in favor, and that opened the door to a more coordinated, again, multilateral way to help countries in need.
Colleagues, do we have further questions? Have a question from the floor?
I'll have a couple of comments, really, rather than a question, because I'll let Jean-Pierre get stuck in with the real questions. But It's very interesting listening to both of your excellent presentations. Really, really got me thinking about some of our overarching themes of the day. I mean, this afternoon we've been talking a lot about transparency, we've been talking a lot about trust, we've been talking a lot about institutions. And in a way, to take those in reverse order, I see a convergence between the two of you really in a certain, I suppose, skepticism vis-a-vis the IMF, given past IMF conditionality record in Africa notably. But I wonder whether, and of course, is the IMF an institution? Well, it's an international organization, but it has institutional characteristics. Can you, when institutions exist, certainly like the IMF, can we simply, I mean, can institutions that already exist no longer exist in a way? Or is there a sort of institutional lethargy that means that it's actually extremely difficult in the long run to move these institutions? It's a question more than anything else. But the second point was when you talked about transparency in the ex-ante framework, Paola. And I thought that was very interesting. But I was wondering if you could just elucidate a little bit more about what would transparency look like in that ex-ante framework. And then the final question, really, it's about Jean-Pierre's question on inflation. And I suppose the point with inflation, and I'm not an economist, so I'll just give my layman's view, but clearly, from a trust perspective, if you're an investor, then clearly you can see that inflation can create a long-term problem, can't it? I mean, if you're investing and you're particularly if you're a small investor, and if you're a small investor who might get a haircut because of the wrong, the decisions taken by someone, then it can be clearly damaging to trust. So there are three comments, not really questions, but I am particularly interested in the view on the IMF, actually.
Okay. Can I paraphrase you just in case? Yeah. Is it can we uninvent the IMF or something? That's probably a bit crudely.
Does the IMF exist?
Yeah.
Can we, not so much can we go beyond the IMF, because that's clearly the sentiment, but what can you do anyway with an institution like the IMF that exists? Once I'm not being deterministic here, but clearly weighty international institutions that exist and that have existed are quite difficult to move in the long run.
Should I try to give some views on this? I want to bring the European experience to answer that question, because basically when the European sovereign crisis starts, we were faced with the realization that we did not have, and this is quite well known in Asia, a European monetary fund, as Asia and the Japanese in particular, after the Asian financial crisis, realized, they didn't like the IMF, but they didn't have anything else. The Europeans, many years later, realized that they didn't like the IMF, but they didn't have anything else. And that's how they created these ESFs, which is basically the proposal we would like to mimic. Because, yes, they could rely on the IMF for the technical part, meaning, yes, let's have an IMF program. They called it Troika. It was not only the IMF, it was the European Central Bank, the Commission, and the IMF owning the program that would make the finances of those countries receiving assistance sustainable over time. So they brought some knowledge. It's like a consultancy company. It became for the European case, like, let's trust this economist. I used to be an IMF economist running around doing exactly that, programs here and there. So I understand that the IMF didn't like where that was heading, but at the end of the day, they had to agree because that was the one and only way. And by the way, it was very useful because before the EFSF was created, there was no way to inject liquidity. And that's when Greece, blah, blah, blah. So what I'm trying to say here is that I think the IMF can be useful, but it's it cannot be the solution, because the dimension of the program is humongous. SDR, I mean, it's just a tiny, it's great as a signal, but it's tiny for the size of a program. So we need an agency that helps restructure that. And in our proposal, we go beyond the official creditors, because, you know, Anne Kruger, many years ago, I was at the IMF then, started proposing this SDRM, which is a big kind of restructuring machine of debt. And it never went through, because I think it included too much commitment from the official creditors. The idea here is that you just guarantee the capital, the rest comes from private money. So it is important to limit the amount of commitment of the equity holders of the fund, because if not, it will not happen. And the IMF should stay out, sorry to say, and should be a force driving the analysis needed to know whether debt would be sustainable once you swap it, because you need to know whether the swapping part is enough. Yeah, I mean, maybe you do it and then the country is still unable to repay. So you need somebody to do that part of analysis. The IMF is the right place to do it. So I'm not saying kicking the IMF. I'm saying letting the IMF do what the IMF is good at, not allowing the IMF to step in one more function which the IMF frankly has no experience with. That's the point for me.
Paola, do you have anything to add on that question?
And let me tell you what is the IMF is for. The IMF was actually created, is one of the Bretton Woods institutions, was established in 1944 at Bretton Woods to provide the financial safety net to a system which was based, again, without going into the technical details, on a fixed exchange rate. So basically the IMF helped the adjustment and helped countries then run into balance of payments imbalances, and had then to adjust. When the Bretton Woods system finished in terms of this convertibility into dollars gold and the gold windows, as they used to be called, the IMF got into a crisis as an institution, because basically it was left without a clear objective, because that was taken away. And obviously, it has gone through the period what we call Washington Consensus that reflected the political, the economic policies and the political position of its main shareholder, i.e. the United States. And so we got through this Washington Consensus, which was extremely what we call neoliberal approach to economic policies, which says basically, if you want to be rescued by the IMF, you need to take these programs, and then you have to go. And there is nothing wrong with conditionality. Bear in mind, it sounds like a bad word because of what actually was this Washington Consensus come up with, because basically it became an instrument to push extremely tough economic policy, fiscal policy, privatization, and so on. But conditionality is necessary inside a multilateral institution. So the simple fact that you want to remove the moral hazard, otherwise, and I would go to your point about accountability, country A with a rugged government, but needing money, could actually go down into a indebtedness spree with no control, and we know there are these cases, and then use the IMF money. That means the multilateral institution, all countries, member states contribute to that money in a sort of uncontrolled way. So conditionality is important exactly for this reason. It's good accountability. Now, the point is what the IMF did since the 1980s with this conditionality. They made it into a straitjacket, then constrained many, many countries. Things are changing, and they're changing dramatically. First change was in 2009 when the IMF accepted to create this liquidity flexible credit line for countries with good fundamentals, so non-conditionality. Countries were very reluctant to signed for this line because they were not sure what it meant to go to the IMF and say, hey guys, I need a bit of money. But now it has become a more sort of, it's become a normal. So something is not the exception, but it becomes the normal, the IMF. So there are more flexible instruments that go beyond conditionality when it is necessary to help countries for some short-term liquidity need. And this is really something the IMF states provide. Third point, the IMF, so that means there is this change in approach, which is very, very important. And to some extent now, the current managing director has pushed this in a very clear way. In fact, last year she was very clear about the role of the IMF in supporting countries in need during the pandemic. And in fact, the amount of resources that were made available were very significant. And I would say the IMF and the World Bank play a much more significant role last year in the middle of the pandemic, when everything, in the middle of the outbreak, than the G20. The G20 were, especially because of the Saudi presidency, they were very, very in the, sort of in the back row, not very exposed. So the IMF is changing. The Washington consensus, I would say, is dead, which is great. And so, and partly, and one of the reasons for this is because of the role of China as a bilateral lender. That has pushed the thing is that, okay, now what is the alternative? Can we have another system? No, because China cannot play the role of, the lender of last resort for the reason I said before, because China lends in dollars and it's a huge risk for them. And then is the number of dollars of for China are lost, but they are finite, while, the IMF can always use it. But let me say, the third problem about the IMF is the role of the United States. The United States and Congress have opposed the reform of the IMF for a long time. It's been very painful to watch. They stomp on the reform, then very basic governance reform, then the G20 agreed in 2010. It took almost 6 years for Congress to approve that reform. Now we're going through another quarter revision. And why is important? Because quotas are the resources of the IMF. And obviously, the US doesn't want to put, certainly under Trump, now things have changed. They don't want to put more resources in the IMF because obviously the Trump administration hated all the multilateral institutions. At the same time, they didn't want to get anybody else, putting more resources and taking a bigger role. So again, these things are changing, but we need to watch this space. The point about accountability and transparency is very, very important. And again, I cannot stress more, and they've got plenty of cases of countries that go into, they incur into debt simply because the government is unaccountable and non-transparent. And in that sense, having bilateral lenders is great for countries who do not want to be more transparent, because multilateral lending requires this transparency. And that's why it's so important to have it. Bilateral, you do what you like. It's like when you personally go to ask for, to be for a loan from, a friend or a shark, a loan shark, and then, that is your business. You don't have to disclose anything. While, if you go through sort of more reputable channels, there will be a transparency, a trail of documents that proves the transaction and the conditions that are implied in that transaction.
I'm listening to both of you here, and an idea's forming in my head. It sometimes works that way, slowly. And the idea is this, that really this isn't so much about COVID-19. These are long-term structural problems. We had Bretton Woods, and then we had agreements around about 2008, some success there, and it's just that we need to cope with these longer term problems. Perhaps COVID-19 has brought it right to the fore a little quicker. Is that idea correct or not? It's not really about COVID, is it? It's long-term developments, isn't it?
Yeah, just a comment quickly. I think you're right. I mean, many of the things we think are happening because of COVID were bound to happen anyway. I mean, the amount of the worsening in income distribution in the world before COVID was already mind-boggling. And if you ask me, I fully agree with Paola on the idea that the Washington Consensus is dead. If you read literally the statements and the documents produced for the latest annual meetings, it sounds like the World Bank. I mean, it's all about environment, income distribution. By the way, not very different from the Biden administration, I have to say. So I think the world has realized that the type of capitalism we had just can't hold anymore. And I think China is, in a way, pushing that because it's a model that I mean, there's competition in models, which I think is good for you to kind of wake up and do things. And there's a lot of ideas there from Mariana Mazzucato on the entrepreneurial stage to Schwab, this idea of the Davos. I mean, the stakeholder, the state as stakeholder, and many others. In a nutshell, I think all of this was happening before COVID, but COVID just accelerates the need to reshape our model, our economic, socioeconomic model. And that's why we are having this conversation, frankly speaking. The problem is there's some small economic data point, let's put it like that, like debt, okay, that cannot be solved only with wonderful words like climate change, income distribution. No, they are pressing and they are immediate. So my worry is that we think, oh, let's move to this new world where everything is green, and we start daydreaming. And poor countries remain poor and they are saddled with debt, and we're not offering any solutions. So I would like, frankly speaking, the IMF to, become a different institution, but do not forget their task regarding that accumulation of debt that has not been cleaned. And they have a lot of experience. Let me finish with this, because they did the HIPC initiative. Yeah, I mean, basically bringing debt down for very poor countries. They know how to do it. We need that expertise, but I think we need it in a way where they do not dominate the discussion. That's why I think the European model is important, because we need more ownership of the creditors and the debtors.
Thank you, Alicia. I think if we had one really pressing question from colleagues, then we could probably squeeze it in. Yeah.
Sorry, can I squeeze a very brief question to Huang, because actually I had another question regarding his presentation and the role of the leader. One of the, in looking at various countries, one important variable has been whether the leaders and the government have been consistent in their policy, in their reaction to COVID. It has not always been easy to be consistent because there was kind of driving in the fog, I mean, they didn't know where the crisis was heading to, and there was a lack of information, But leaders who have changed their mind, and changed their strategy over the years have been disqualified by the public. I mean, including French President Macron. Yeah. But another criteria I would like to add to that, another variable, if you want. I don't know whether it fits in your own model, is the fact that there have been big differences between countries with borders and countries without borders. If you see what I mean. Yeah. Islands, yes, by definition, can protect themselves pretty easily. Taiwan, Japan, South Korea is de facto an island. But on the opposite of the game, I mean, you've got the European Union, where it's impossible to close borders because you have people working in one country, leaving the other country, and that's how COVID was much harder for any leader to manage, be it the French, the German, or other leaders of the member states of the European Union. That's just something I wanted to add. I had a question, if I may, to the two speakers about China and China's attitude toward debt relief. I've seen some changes. I mean, of course, the debt relief granted by China has always been very symbolic, very small. But for Angola and some other African countries, I think The debt relief granted by China has added in the last few months to more than $7 billion. So it's not minuscule. So I just wanted to see whether, in your view, is a change of mind, a change of attitude of China regarding debt relief, or just a small gesture made by China. That's all.
I can pick up the debt relief on China. Yes, of course. China's been very involved in this, and China is a signatory of this, the SSI. And there is also a very pragmatic attitude, which is, better to be sort of flexible and try to hopefully help this country and eventually get something back, rather than take a tough position. This really is a sensible position. What we have noticed in the past, China is not inclined to go for any debt, cancellation, like the one we had, for example, at the beginning of the millennium, as again, it was a result of the, at the time, G8 action. For the simple reason that China is more exposed than other countries, certainly than countries like the United States are, to debt relief, because as I said, is this a dollar element in their exposure. I'll leave to the question about Europe to Alicia.
Thank you.
I just want to add something to put China's participation, but also the size of the whole DSSI in context. The actual amount subject to debt relief, and I want to remind the audience that this is only basically a delay in payment of debt service, up to December 2021, is 5 billion, 5.2, I believe, $5 billion US. So we're talking peanuts. All of these things written about the SSI, I'm like, the paper is more than the actual amount swapped, or not swapped, but pushed forward. So it is a no-brainer that if I were China, I would sign in, because it's nothing. It allows me to then, have bilateral discussions without arguing that I didn't participate. So it's not a big break. For me, it's not a no-brainer that China would want to jump in, because the amounts are very small. Countries were reluctant because for many, those issuing Eurobonds or other types of bond debt, they were risking being downgraded because of this. So, who's going to do it, frankly speaking? So no doubt. I have a problem. I couldn't hear well the question on Europe because the sound was a little bit. So very briefly, Ed, if you could summarize very briefly.
All right. Yeah, that's for me. So I basically, you asked a very good question. We did not really, we thought about the consistency in terms of the leadership behavior and government behavior, but we only look at the first week reaction. So in crisis of this scale, the quick reaction is so important. So we also track the data after 1 month. We cannot predict anything. So because many other factors jump in. So in terms of border, yes, we're going to control for those islands and border. We haven't done it, but we'll do that. Thank you.
Alicia, it seems the question was for Sue, actually. It was about his study of Chinese MERS and their handling of the initial stages of the outbreak. So it wasn't actually aimed at you. Okay, well, look, thank you very much, colleagues. I can see no more hands up. Could I just draw it up to a conclusion verbally by thanking both Alicia and Paola for presenting. It's a great pity that we couldn't have you here in person, because we would now take you off to a sumptuous dinner. Well, maybe not that.
Don't even tell us this, Ed. Please spare this to us. I'm dreaming of your dim sums. Yes,
indeed. But 3 weeks in a hotel, not even Taiwan, by the way. Doesn't pay off for the dim sum. I'm sorry.
Next time, post-COVID. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our speakers and Sue.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye indeed.